For joining us today. My name's Shannon Smith, and I'm the Nebraska Invasive Species Council Coordinator. And I'm here to present with Game and Parks Commission our first annual Nebraska Invasive Species Awareness Week, which is running this year from May 26th to May 30th. We've celebrated the week, I don't know about celebrated, but raised awareness with different webinars throughout this week. This is our third webinar. And we will be concluding with an in-person event as well. So for tomorrow, we are going to have a webinar called Weeds, 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 Nebraska's Invasive Aquatic Plants, and that will be Friday, May 30th from 1 to 2 p.m. Central, also online on Zoom. You can go to calendar.outdoornebraska.gov to learn more and get the link for that. Should be very interesting. And then on Saturday, if you're in the Nebraska area, we are having our first annual Know Your Nebraska Invasives Day. It's going to be at Pawnee State Recreation Area in Lincoln from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. We're going to have a lot of fun activities and events to learn more about Nebraska's invasive species. So we hope you will join us. And so without further ado, and actually, I'm so sorry, I need to pull up my little introduction. I knew I'd forget something. So I'm going to introduce our speaker today here, which is Sara Rickfels from the Invasive Species Action Network. And she's going to be presenting on Don't Let It Loose and the Pet Release Pathway. And so Sara is the executive director of the Invasive Species Action Network, a nonprofit based out of Livingston, Montana. She also serves on Montana's Invasive Species Council as the conservation organization representative and is chair of the Education Outreach Committee for the Western Regional Panel on Aquatic Nuisance Species. Her work at ISAN spans multiple pathways and taxa. So without further ado, Sara, please take it away. Oh,
Thanks.
and I actually, sorry, one more thing is that we will do questions at the end. So if you have a question, you'll notice at the bottom of the page, there's a little tab and the one of the boxes on the right says Q&A. So if you have a question, please feel free to type it in there. And now, Sara, please take it away.
Okay. Okay, I think you should be able to see that full screen now.
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, perfect. So, as Shannon said, my name's Sara Rickliffs. I'm the executive director at ISAN, and we've been doing the Don't Let It Loose program on a multi-state level since about 2012. So today I'm going to talk to you about that program as well as the pet release pathway, which is what it's designed to address. And while we go through it, hopefully you'll get to see lots of very cute pictures of pets from around the US. So just a little bit about ISAN itself. We are a really small nonprofit based out of Montana. This is our mission statement to reduce the human-caused spread of invasive species through voluntary behavior change. And that through voluntary behavior change is really just a ticketed item that shows that we employ a lot of community-based social marketing practices. Don't Let It Loose is not our only program. We also do a lot of clean, drain, dry outreach, largely directed at the paddling community or non-motorized boat users. We also have a forest pest program and some smaller projects that are really just centered around responsible behavior. So whether that be responsible pet ownership or responsible outdoor recreation, we try our best to spread the word about how to prevent invasive species in those spaces. Our two other team members are Jen Riddle, she's our programs manager, and Erin Bjorklund, she's our outreach coordinator. And without their very hard work and dedication, we just really wouldn't be where we are today. So I try my best to always give thanks where thanks is due, and Erin and Jen certainly deserve it, as do our predecessors, right? The Don't Let It Loose program would just simply not be what it is today without those who came before us. So this is kind of the path that we're going to walk today. Today's a bit of a long webinar, but we're going to start with the issue itself, so the pet release pathway itself. This is an article out of Wyoming. This is about kind of a chronic historic dumping issue at Kelly Warm Springs, which, if you're not familiar, that's located right around Grand Teton National Park. One of the things that we hear a lot about with the pet release pathway is, right, these pets can't make it through the winter. So I just want to make a note to say that we see impacts from the pet release pathway in places where we probably wouldn't expect it. And they span all taxa. It's not limited by geography. We see a lot of media coverage. You've probably seen headlines like this. And so I just want to demonstrate how broad these impacts are and how this pathway really does span across taxa and geography. So just to kind of dive in a little more, right? Globally, we see that pet releases are contributing to lots of species invasions, and that can be kind of difficult to quantify, right? If we're not seeing the actual pet release, a lot of times it's an assumed pet release pathway. Um, but we're seeing this whole issue be exacerbated largely by commerce. So pet in ownership is increasing, right? We saw a huge surge of pet ownership increase in the pandemic. We had a little bit of a dip after that, but now that we're seeing Gen Z kind of come into adulthood, we're seeing that pet ownership increase yet again. And part of that is just the pet trade is expanding. They have a lot of easier access, right? We can move about the globe with a whole lot greater ease than we used to be able to. And so can these pet trade species and invasive species in general. This is just a general impact on invasive species and invasive ecology. There's also a lot wider species available. So with online commerce, we're seeing just many, many more species available to pet owners across the world. You know, no longer do you walk into a pet store and see like goldfish and betta and puppies and kittens and a couple of birds. We don't see that anymore. We see huge, wide varieties of pet species available within the trade. So this is a really busy slide, and I apologize for that. Both of these figures came from the same paper. If you're interested when I get done and reading the paper, you can scan that QR code there and read all about it. But we'll start with the left side with all of these pie charts. So basically, it's breaking up the global species pool, so all the species across the world into these families. And in the far left column, you see the red pie pieces are smaller. The red pie pieces are representing the proportion of those species who are known to be invasive species. And this paper defined invasive species as any species with a range established outside its natural range. So you can see those proportions range anywhere from 1 to just under 5%. And then when we go to the other three columns, the right box, that's the traded species pool, right? We see those red pie pieces are much larger than they were in the global species pool. And that's just representing that within the pet trade, whether that be on a global basis or a country basis, those invasive species are just disproportionately represented within the pet trade. And if you move to the second figure here with the ant and the commercial success, this is kind of demonstrating the why that is, right? So life history traits and characteristics that make a species really great for the pet trade, whether that be just for pet trade production on the front end or for pet ownership, ease of pet ownership on the back end. Those life history traits are directly contributed to both them being in the pet trade, but also their invasiveness and their those qualities. So that can be things like high reproductive fecundity makes them easier to produce to put into the pet trade, or habitat and food generalism. Those are easy traits for both production, but also for the pet owner. It makes their requirements at home and in a new place not so difficult. So just to represent one of the reasons why the pet release pathway is um, such an impactful pathway is just the fact that more often than out in the wild in their native space, these species are invasive. So there's a lot of reasons why the pet release pathway is impactful to the natural resources, but I want to highlight three. So one is just depletion of overall resources, right? We can think of this from a native species standpoint, where these pets being released and becoming invasive species, they can outcompete for critical resources in the wild with our native flora and fauna. But also, we need to think about it from an investment standpoint. And if these species are established, we will have to invest lots of monetary resources for things like early detection and rapid response or removal and eradication. And then in the middle, we have novel disease. We know the pet release pathway has contributed to novel diseases in the wild. Some of those are affecting native fauna, like our chytrid fungus, the crayfish plague. Those are just two bigger examples within novel disease from contributions from the pet release pathway. And then, of course, potential impacts to our human health. And then lastly, I just want to note about hybridization. So when we have pet species released that are closely related to our native populations, hybridization can occur. This is really, um, this is a good example is crayfish. They are hybridizing pretty readily. And we know based on research that we can expect this hybridization to increase in occurrence as we experience further climate change. So that's kind of the 10,000-foot look at the issue. And so we'll kind of talk now about the scope of the issue and more so the scope of pet ownership. So in 2024, the pet industry reported $152 billion in revenue, and we know that nearly 100 million households across the US have pets. This is now led by Gen Z. They are the most likely generation to have pets. They're also the most likely generation to have multiple pets. So we can see that driving those sales. 2024 sales were higher than 2023. The pet industry, based on reporting from the ASPCA, is expecting higher sales in 2025. And then these two statistics about online versus in-store shopping is just kind of an insight into how we deliver the program. So it's about split half and half, whether you're searching for products online or typically shopping in store. This is the one that is concerning to me. So, in the 2024 report, 22% of pet owners reported that they're concerned about access to pet services and affordability. And this is just an indicator of something to watch of the potential for more pet release to become a problem. So, outreach to pet owners indicating that they need to rehome rather than release will be imperative here if this number is to increase with further inflation. So, um, now we can talk about the program itself. So our overall goal is to foster these responsible pet ownership behaviors. And really, that's just always rehome and never ever release. And so ultimately, the ideal goal is to also reduce the occurrence of pet release in the wild. And we do these by promoting those responsible behaviors and also providing rehoming resources. And on this slide, you'll note that I wrote pets and plants. It's important to remember that when we talk about pet release and aquarium dumping and terrarium dumping, we're not just talking about the pet within that habitat, we're talking about everything, the contents of that aquarium and terrarium, right? These plants can pose serious risk to our environment, but so can some of the bacteria that might be living within those waters or just the substrate within that tank. These are all really important measures to make note of. So pet ownership overall, right? We can think about this in a really simplified manner of you get a new pet, you're so excited, and then for any number of reasons, you may end up at a point where you can no longer take care of that pet. And we're not here to make judgment on why that reasoning is, right? It could be lodging or monetary or medical reasons. We don't need to know that. We just need to know that once you hit this point in your ownership, that you make the right choice. And obviously, rehoming or finding a shelter or a rescue organization that can take that pet, that's the correct route to go. And we want to make sure you never, ever, ever release. So, this identifies where our messaging for the Don't Let It Loose program needs to hit. And that's here before you make that choice, right? So, we could hit you before you become a pet owner or during your time as a pet owner. We just want to make sure that you understand the message and you find those resources when or if you end up in this situation of no longer being able to take care of that pet. So we do that from a kind of multifaceted fashion. We work really closely with state and federal agencies. We establish pet rehoming networks with independent pet stores. This is often done on a state-by-state basis in very close collaboration with the state agencies. We also do some indirect messaging with our high-risk water body signages. These are fully customizable for the locality, whether that be on a state basis or just a regional basis. Basically, the state agency or whatever agency we're working with identifies the highest risk water bodies, which are often urban or suburban locations. And then the sign will state, right, dumping an aquarium is never the right choice. Here's the impacts, here's the legality, here's how to report, and here's who to contact if you see this activity happening. And then we have targeted advertising. When we have dedicated funding to do so, we like to do online search advertising that's picked up by keyword searches like rehome my frog, can't take care of my turtle anymore, can I release this fish? Those kinds of keywords will ping an advertisement that basically lets the user navigate to the Don't Let It Loose website where they can learn more about responsible pet ownership behaviors and also find the rehoming resources that we have on that page. And then lastly, we try our best to work really closely with industry partners. With the independent pet stores and our industry partners, they're really trusted resources for these pet owners. And so they'll put out key messaging on their social media or their website, sometimes even in hard copy within their products. And then also we've in the past worked really closely with them to go to pet trade expos and that sort of thing. So just to kind of demonstrate how we go about this. Often we reach out to an agency or an agency reaches out to us about maybe chronic or historic issues with the pet release pathway, and we come up with a plan identifying pet store partners within the area. And often we at ISAN come to your state. We will walk into those pet stores. We talk to pet store staff about how to talk to customers about the issue. Here are materials to give out. Are you willing to be a rehoming partner? If not, are you willing to be just an outreach partner, right? We want to encourage participation in any way that these pet store partners can participate. And sometimes we do talk directly to pet owners. So sometimes, dependent on funding and availability in our capacity, right? You know, we're a small team. We can talk directly to pet owners at trade expos and reptile expos and that sort of thing. But largely, we really rely on this triangle of collaboration between our agencies, our industry partners, and getting that message out directly to pet owners. And within this process, we always elicit feedback from everyone involved. So we talked about resources and, we walk into pet stores and we provide materials and outreach and education. Resources, what do those look like? So on the left here, you'll see this is a fish bag. It's branded with the Don't Let It Loose logo and also the Ripple logo. So this is a partner bag. Ripple is an organization that largely works out of the Great Lakes area. And so in the Great Lakes area, this fish bag is pretty common to find. In other states, we often just have the Don't Let It Loose bag. This serves as a reminder to a pet owner and a pet store staff to discuss the Don't Let It Loose program and visually remind those pet owners about the Don't Let It Loose program and being a responsible pet owner. In the middle, you see Jen. She's our programs manager. She's out at a pet trade expo with Josh's Frogs. They're a really well-known pet industry supplier. And so at this particular expo, Jen was able to talk to attendees, but also Josh's Frogs staff were immediately directing their customers to Jen to talk about Don't Let It Loose right after buying, whether it was like crickets for the pets that they already have or new pets. And so this was a really great partnership. It reduced cost on our end, but also kind of helped foster that relationship that we have with the industry. And then on the right, this is an example of one of our high-risk water body signs. So this is actually in my hometown here in Lewistown. It's an urban park that has 3 ponds. They're called the Frog Ponds, and they are just a high-risk area. They're so close to town, and goldfish have been spotted in those ponds. So, but this is just an example of what you might encounter if you come across one of these signs. So on the left here, I talked about our targeted advertising. This is the last targeted ad that we ran. It comes in all sorts of different sizes based on the web page or app that the user might be reading, and it just directs them to the Don't Let It Loose page where they can learn more and access those rehoming resources. And then on the right, you could scan that QR code. Those are all of our classroom resources. We've got lots of stuff, whether it be worksheets or videos. This particular screenshot is of a video directed at K through 12 learners and educators about the impacts from bullfrogs who have been introduced partially because of the pet release pathway. And then we have our pledges. So I mentioned that we employ community-based social marketing practices. These pledges are a cornerstone of that mindset, right? So on the right, this is a screenshot of one that we give to K through 12 educators. Basically, when they employ Don't Let It Loose resources in their classroom and talk to their students about Don't Let It Loose, those students can sign and state that I pledge to be a responsible pet owner and to never ever release my pets. And they can send stuff home to their families and that sort of thing. On the top left, we have our pet rehoming partner pledge, and this is more for pet stores and industry partners, basically saying like, yes, I want to be listed as a pet rehoming partner, basically getting them listed on the website so that pet owners can reach out and say, hey, I need to rehome this pet at their capacity, right? And make sure that they're talking about the Don't Let It Loose message in their stores with their customers and their staff. And then lastly, that they'll uphold industry standards for things like animal care. And then lastly, this is a photo from one of our pet rehoming events. We started taking a dry erase board and getting people's physical signatures saying that, yes, I will be a responsible pet owner. And it's just a physical pledge to back up what we preach. So I mentioned really briefly the rehoming events. This is kind of a recent adaptation of the program. We're really excited about it. We've done two events in Montana, the first of which was at Zoo Montana in Billings. They were a really great partner. We found out that the majority, or maybe not the majority, but a lot of their animal exhibits are actually former pets, including one of their grizzly bears, actually. And so Zoo Montana was just a great choice to have this event, and we had a lot of learned lessons. It was our first one. And then our second one was just a few weeks ago at University of Montana in Missoula. We scheduled it to be during Dead Week with the idea that we would be targeting residents in the dorms who maybe have aquarium pets that are going to end up in a temporary housing situation for the summer, whether that be for internships or headed back home to their parents or whatever. Maybe they're not able to keep those aquarium pets that they're able to keep in the dorms. And it was just a really great opportunity to talk to that generation. We were really surprised. Actually, the vast majority of our registrants for that event were actually members of the community. But being in the union during Dead Week was a really great opportunity to talk to lots and lots of students, which is exciting since that generation is now the leading generation for pet ownership. And then in the middle, we just have a couple examples of the pets that we've rehomed. So in the top, that's Murphy. He's a goldfish. He was a prize at the county fair this past summer. And the pet owner who surrendered him just said he just keeps growing and growing, and we just don't think we can continue to upgrade his habitat to facilitate that growth. And once goldfish get this large, it's really difficult to keep them indoors. And so we've kind of found they're kind of a notoriously difficult animal to rehome just because they about have to be housed outside at a large size. And in Montana, that makes them a controlled species. So in order to house goldfish or koi outside, you have to have a permit from FWP. And then in the bottom middle photo, that is Slippy the turtle. He's a red-eared slider, so he's a prohibited species in Montana. He was surrendered at the Billings event, and he was surrendered by someone who had received him from a friend. The friend said he was going to release him in the wild, and the pet owner that surrendered him to us just said, no, I won't let you do that. And he took care of Slippy for years before finding out about this event. And now Slippy is living the very cush life at Zoo Montana in the koi pond. It was a great spot for him because they're really often dealing with permits from FWP, and we knew that they were a responsible place to put a prohibited species. And in the bottom right, we have a hermit crab. We received 6 hermit crabs at Missoula. They were all very large. We've also found that hermit crabs are kind of thought of as a really low maintenance pet, and actually they have a lot of requirements for their habitat, and so they're also kind of difficult to rehome. But we were able to get them to Billings later that week and off to their new home. And then in the top right, we just have some volunteers from our Zoo Montana event showing off some very stylish Don't Let It Loose temporary tattoos. So this is our current reach in that kind of classic um, pet store rehoming network fashion. Um, you can see we've been focusing on the Western states. That's where our funding has largely been sourced from. But once we cover the Western states, we'd really like to move east because, looking at those headlines, right, we know that there's no limitation to the impacts. So we'd really like to grow this footprint more and get those independent pet stores bought in and get high-risk water body signage out on the landscape. So there are still gaps and challenges, right? We've been working on this program for over a decade, and there's always new things and new ways that we can contribute to addressing this pathway. One of which is something that we've asked for, at the very least, from Montana for our state, is a pet ownership census, just to understand risk associated with the pet release pathway, right? It's kind of a way to do a survey to understand, that kind of horizon scan of what could be released and what should we be on the lookout for, and where can we really target our messaging. Big box buy-in, I've talked a lot about in independent stores, and we do work really closely with independent stores, and they have really great relationship with their customers. The big box stores like Petco and PetSmart, they have a huge footprint. And we've just simply not been able to get Don't Let It Loose into those stores. We keep trying and we'll continue to keep trying. They have adopted Habitatitude, which is another program that partially addresses the pet release pathway, and we're happy to be in places with them and working alongside Habitatitude where we can. But it'll just continue to be a goal of ours to get our programming into those big box stores to reach new customers. One thing from kind of a social science standpoint is to understand these drivers of that decision to release instead of rehome. Um, Understanding, is it uninformed pet owners? Is it, excuse me, sorry. Is it misinformed pet owners? Or is it more of an emotional driver, something like um, guilt and shame? What is driving that decision to release that pet versus rehome it? And then something we hear about from partners all the time is kind of the burden of understanding whether your pet is a regulated species is on that pet owner. But often we find that communication about what those regulations are sometimes difficult to find or understand. Sometimes the only place they are is within the administrative code, which is difficult for pet owners to both interpret and find. And so we've been working on a state by state basis with agency staff to kind of interpret and put that regulated species information out on the Don't Let It Loose website so that it's in a place where pet owners are going for resources. And then lastly, funding, right? I think that this is a common call, but we find that the pet release pathway often doesn't really fit into funding boxes, traditional funding boxes for invasive species. We also don't really fit into traditional boxes for where animal shelters and rescues are finding funding opportunities. So we just, we keep trying. Often we end up funding pieces of the program and lack that kind of program level maintenance funding. So, looking to the future, what do we expect and what do we hope for, right? On the left here, this map is just a screenshot from our website of the states that have pet rehoming resources linked. And some of those are much more minimal than others. But obviously, we want to continue to increase our reach, get into classrooms, get more states on board with establishing pet rehoming networks with those independent pet stores, get out to pet trade expos, and um, obviously find more industry partners where we can get that Don't Let It Loose logo and message in those products. And then, of course, the big box stores. And then one organizational goal that we have is just increasing accessibility on all of our materials always. And that's hitting multiple languages. And that can be kind of difficult to fund at this moment in history, but it will continue to be a goal of ours at an organizational level. This map on the left is a very similar map, but it's demonstrating what we have currently on the website for those pet regulations of prohibited and controlled species. So we'd also like to work further with zoos and aquariums. We have a really awesome relationship and really grateful for our relationship with Zoo Montana and Billings. We've met with the Association of Zoos and Aquariums multiple times, not only to talk to them about how to incorporate Don't Let It Loose in their messaging and their education, but also how can we help them with their program of Not a Pet, because I think there's a lot of really great potential for overlap there, and that's just a relationship we're continuing to explore. Something we hear from partners all across the US continuously is that military installations and areas around military installations tend to have historic dumping activity. And so we're currently trying to understand how best we can fit in. Can we message to military personnel? Is that more indirect messaging with signages around military installments? How can we help with that issue? And then a coastal issue that we'd like to work on is this pulse and soft coral issue. Soft corals are really common in the pet trade, and they are having enormous impact in the wild once released. So places that are experiencing this are like Pearl Harbor and Hawaii, and Puerto Rico's have a lot of issue with this. So we want to both help those who are managing this issue, but also help in a preventative space in coastal and island environments where they haven't been introduced. And then in 2024, the Invasive Species Advisory Council is a federal body, put out a recommendation. You can scan the QR code to see the paper. This is for island environments specifically, that's kind of referred to as the island paper. Specifically recommends that the federal agencies focus on Don't Let It Loose messaging and programming, um, including greater attention to marine aquariums. So I think because a lot of our efforts have been landlocked, some of that has not necessarily been with the marine aquarium industry. And so we'd like to be a part of that and push that recommendation and work toward it. And whenever I can, I like to end a presentation with a call to action. And calls to action, not necessarily if you're not a state agency employee or you don't work for a conservation district, but maybe you're just a concerned community member or a pet owner, right? There are lots of things that you can do. Just talking about pet release and its impacts is a really impactful step. That's a really common call to action for climate change. It's no different for other issues, especially with invasive species. Just talking about it gets the word out. Um, of course, reporting releases. So if you ever see a dumped aquarium or you spot a goldfish in a wild area, right? Report that to an agency or your local law enforcement. Help facilitate rehoming. So if you work for a pet store or you have a friend who says, "Man, I really can't take care of this turtle anymore," right? Direct them to the Don't Let It Loose website. Help them facilitate that rehoming. You can advocate for regulations, whether this is species regulations or just local enforcements. Um, that's always helpful. And then, of course, advocating for funding, whether that just be for invasive species prevention at all or natural resource education, the pet release pathway, um, any and all advocation for that is super helpful. So with that, I've got all of our contact information, our 3 emails. My cell phone number is here. We are not in the office all that often. We mostly work from home. So um, please call me on that cell phone. I may not get back to you quick enough on that office phone. And of course, you can follow us on social media. The Don't Let It Loose program has a dedicated Facebook page, or you can follow Invasive Species Action Network on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. So, with that, I'd be more than happy to take questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's very interesting, and I am happy to kick off our questions while we wait for some in the chat.
Yeah.
So my first question was, for some of these pet surrender events or when you're contacted for a pet surrender, Are you seeing any trends in the type of pets that are being surrendered? It seems like a lot of reptiles and fish. And then also, I was curious, are you coming across common reasons for why they're rehoming? Like, are they just kind of like, oh, I didn't know this was going to live so long, or I didn't realize how expensive the food was going to be, or I don't know if you've noticed any trends in what you're seeing.
So our funding is specifically for aquatic pets. So the closest thing to non-aquatic that we've rehomed would be those hermit crabs, which are semi-aquatic, so we accepted them. But that's part of what's driving that. What we do here at all of our events is that it's a need. Um, you know, Animal rescues and shelters play a really critical role in pet rehoming, but often most of them don't take non-traditional pets. And so it can be difficult for folks to navigate that. So we do find a common thread is that it's just a need, and thank you. Um, the turtles that we've received, um, that most often is we didn't know it was going to live this long. So we rehomed three turtles at the last event. One was 15 years old, one was 8 years old, and then the other was at least 5, is what we were told. So I think that's a big driver. Those county fair goldfish, all 4 goldfish that we took in at Missoula, those were all county fair prizes. And the same thing of just like, we did not know they were going to get giant. And so I think there's a lot of back end education in instances like that.
Thank you. And then we had another question, which is it still damaging to release a pet that is native to the area you're releasing it in?
So I would say my prime concern for that specific species and animal and individual would be once they've been housed in a pet situation, they're just unlikely to have a good time if they're released, right? It's inhumane to release them once they've been in a pet situation. So whether it's an invasive species or a native species, that's a prime concern. Secondarily, even if they're a native species, I'm concerned about things like introduction of novel disease, or, bacterial or viral that could come from that previous environment and putting them into a new environment. So it's a great question. Um, the general rule of thumb is just never release.
Thank you. And we had another question pop in. It said, great job. Do you see a new animal or plant that maybe there's going to be a new issue with it being released? So I think the question he's asking is, are you seeing any new pets being released that you hadn't seen in the past? Like I know you showed an axolotl in one of your slides. I know those are kind of a new trending pet. So I wonder if you're
Yeah.
seeing anything else there.
Yeah, I think, there's species that get all the attention, right? Goldfish get a whole lot of attention. Most recently, there were a lot of articles put out after the Fish and Wildlife Service made a post about goldfish, and I think goldfish are going to continue to be a big problem just because partially you can buy a goldfish or win a goldfish just about anywhere. I do think, one of the things that gets a little forgotten are those aquatic plants. And I think that's where we get really concerned. About, some notorious aquatic invasive species like hydrilla can be purchased online for aquariums. And I think those kinds of things are what I'm super concerned about.
Yes, and I had kind of a follow-up question there because I know we're seeing a lot of increase with e-commerce. People can
Right.
buy anything online to get shipped to them from other countries, and there's not always regulations in place if it's considered invasive or it's not allowed in the state. Have you worked at all with any e-commerce organizations, or is that in your plan at all to kind of build awareness as well?
We'd like to. E-commerce and trade is a little overwhelming because it's so large and it's like, how do you tackle that problem? Because the problem has so many fingers, right? I will say the Great Lakes has a really awesome program. It's called Gladiator, and it's basically a web crawling application that looks for e-commerce that says like, we'll ship this to Wisconsin. And then it pings someone in an official capacity at Wisconsin, and Wisconsin can reach out to that person and say, hey, no, you can't. Please stop and cease and desist. And then that's a good first step and identifier to just monitoring for that regulation and enforcement. So, um, I do think that e-commerce is a really critical step in prevention. But I think at some point we'll have to see something like Gladiator really get scaled up.
Thank you. And I had one more question, and we'll see if any others pop in the chat. So I'm going to pose kind of a hypothetical question to you, which is, let's say I have an exotic pet, and maybe it's, for example, like the grizzly bear situation that, maybe I got from not necessarily legal means, or I got it in another state, brought it here, and, I need to surrender it, but I don't want to because I'm afraid of getting charged or facing some sort of legal consequence. Is there anywhere I can go to do this and where I don't get in trouble, or what would be my next step?
Yeah, so I will say Florida's program is known as an amnesty program. So, no questions asked in Florida. You can say, I have a grizzly bear. I need to get rid of this grizzly bear, and they'll help you walk through that. Um, Not all states are necessarily willing to take on that amnesty title. And part of that is because the regulation is not necessarily just on a state or local basis, right? That regulation can be something like a federal injurious species, could be a Lacey Act violation, and that's a liability ultimately on those state enforcement agencies. So I can't say that there's a great opportunity for you if you have an illegal pet that you obtained illegally to circumvent enforcement. I will say, um, the best option is to certainly rehome it, and maybe fessing up to local law enforcement is a good first step. Um, I I don't know that I have a super great answer for that.
No, that's still very helpful though. Thank you. And then, so if somebody does have not a reptile or amphibian, who would you recommend? Would it be worth reaching out to Humane Society or any other places that you'd recommend they'd reach out to try and rehome these pets?
So, sometimes there are like species specific rescues that will work with you. And even if they're not close, a lot of times they'll help you, meet in the middle kind of transportation stuff. But I would just say, even if it's not, if it's an exotic pet, go ahead and take a look at Don't Let It Loose and check out those resources for your state. See if there's anything close by. Often, if a pet store or one of those resources can't help you, they'll have suggestions for like, you should check out this person. They would probably be willing to help you. I will say, like zoos and aquariums, obviously they're getting approached and sometimes they're able to take in. That's a possibility, but it's just one of those, you never know who has capacity at any given time. So yeah, I would just say start calling. You can also obviously use things like Facebook groups as long as it's a legal pet.
That's very true. Thank you so much. And yes, we do. So in Nebraska, we do have quite a bit of exotic pet auctions that you'll see out in small towns. So for any of you that might attend one of those, we do recommend if you see a pet you're interested in, checking that it's legal and making sure there's no specific requirements for your city or county that you need to follow in order to get the pet. So just make sure you're following the laws. But I think that is all our questions. If you have any other questions that pop up, you can email Sarah. Her email's on the screen, sarah@stopais.org. And you can also email our Invasive Species Council if you have any questions about pet rehoming or anything like that. We are working on a list of resources to put on our website, and our email is just invasives@unl.edu. So thank you so much, Sarah. That was super interesting and I think super relevant for Nebraska. So we really appreciate having you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Yes, and thank you all so much for coming. We hope you'll join us tomorrow. We will also have another webinar at 1 p.m. Central Time. There's a link on calendar.outdoornebraska.gov. So we hope you will join us and thank you so much for spending Nebraska Invasive Species Awareness Week with us. Have a great rest of your day.